The morning the letter came, the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator sigh, that soft little hum it makes right before the motor kicks in again. And for some reason, that sound made me feel older than anything else, older than the ache in my knees or the pill bottles lined up like little soldiers on the kitchen counter, older even than the framed photo of my wedding day that has turned the faint color of tea. And I remember thinking, well, Margaret, if the appliances are starting to sound lonely, it's probably a sign you've been living by yourself a bit too long. But I still wasn't prepared for the envelope with my daughter's neat handwriting on it, resting on the little braided rug just inside the front door where it must have slipped from the mail slot, waiting there like something that had been trying to arrive for years and finally got brave enough to show up. And I stood a moment with my hand on the doorknob, feeling the cool metal under my fingers, trying to decide if I wanted to pick it up or just step over it and pretend I hadn't seen it. But of course that's not the kind of mother I am. So I bent down, my joints complaining, and picked it up, my thumb brushing over Mom, written in that steady blue ink that always makes me picture my daughter as the girl with the ponytail and the backpack, not the busy woman in her 50s who calls me on Sunday nights on speakerphone while she's loading the dishwasher in another state. I stood at the kitchen sink to open it because that's where I do most of my hard thinking, looking out at the strip of backyard that's more memory than garden now, the crabapple tree leaning slightly like it's listening to what goes on inside, the patchy grass, the fence that Henry always meant to fix but never did, and I could feel my heart beating against my ribs the way it did when I was 16 and waiting to see if a boy would call, which is ridiculous when you're 78 and it's just a letter from your own child. But there it was, that quickening in my chest, that little flicker of dread and hope that seemed to come together more often as you get older. I opened it carefully, sliding my finger under the flap so I wouldn't tear the paper, because I was raised in a time when even envelopes were saved in a drawer, smoothed out and used again for grocery lists. And the first line was, "Mom, I don't know how to say this without worrying you," and I could feel my shoulders tensing, a small tightening at the back of my neck, because nothing good ever starts that way. And I took a breath, smelling the faint linger of last night's coffee in the mug by the sink, and the lemon cleaner I'd used on the counter. Because that's what you do. You notice the ordinary things, so you don't get swept away too quickly by the big ones. "Mom," she wrote, "I've been thinking a lot about you living alone up there." And I could see her frowning a little as she wrote that, pushing her glasses up her nose the way she does when she's trying to organize other people's lives. And after what happened last month with your fall, I really feel like we need to talk about some options. And the word options sat there on the page like a stranger at my kitchen table, because I knew what it meant, or at least I thought I did. And suddenly I wasn't in my little yellow kitchen anymore. I was on the cold bathroom tiles 3 weeks ago, the taste of blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my lip, the sharp pain in my hip when I'd reached too quickly for the towel and lost my balance, that horrible moment of surprise that comes when your own body betrays you, and the long, slow crawl to get myself upright, clutching the edge of the tub, saying out loud, "You're fine, Margaret, you're fine," in the empty house, as if I could bully myself into being unhurt just by using the firm voice my mother used on me. I hadn't told my daughter about the fall right away, not all of it. Just mentioned briefly that I'd lost my footing for a second and had a little bruise because I knew exactly what would happen if I admitted how long it took me to stand up, how winded I was, how my hand shook when I finally made it to the kitchen to sit down. That feeling of being an old woman in a way I hadn't felt before. Not just someone with gray hair and laugh lines, but someone whose bones remembered the ground too well, and I didn't want that version of me to exist in her mind yet. I wasn't ready to see that worry in her eyes. But it's amazing how children, even grown ones, can sniff out the parts of your life you think you've tucked away neatly. The tremor in your voice on the phone, the slight hesitation when you say, "I'm fine." So here it was, in blue ink, on nice stationery, with a little watercolor flower in the corner, because my daughter always tries to soften hard things with pretty touches. "I've been looking at some really lovely senior communities closer to us," she wrote. "Places where you'd have your own apartment, but there would be people around and activities and medical staff right there if you ever needed them." And I could hear the effort in her words, the way she was trying to make it sound like an exciting adventure, a retirement cruise, instead of what it felt like to me, which was the first shovel of dirt on the life Henry and I had built, brick by stubborn brick. My first instinct was anger, a hot little flush in my cheeks that surprised me with its strength, and I found myself saying out loud, "I'm not a piece of furniture to be moved closer to the couch." And then I laughed because I sounded just like my own mother did when we tried to convince her to stop driving at 84, that same small, proud fire. And I thought, oh, so this is how it happens. This is how we become the older generation. Not slowly and gently, but in jolts that leave us blinking. I set the letter on the counter and walked to the back door, the one that sticks a little in humid weather, and I pushed it open, stepping onto the small wooden porch where the paint is peeling in thin curls, and the air smelled like wet earth and cut grass from a neighbor's yard. And somewhere a dog barked lazily, and I stood there barefoot, feeling the rough grain of the boards under my soles, the same boards Henry nailed down himself 38 years ago, whistling under his breath, the same boards my grandchildren used to jump from to play in the sprinkler, shrieking when the cold water hit their legs. And I thought, how do I explain to my daughter that I know this porch as well as I know my own hands, that every creak and splinter and nail is part of my sense of safety, that the idea of a lovely senior community with smooth hallways and identical doors makes me feel like a mismatched sock in a perfect drawer. "You're being dramatic," I told myself, because I have little conversations with myself more and more these days, and I went back inside and picked up the letter again, forcing myself to read the rest, because I raised my children to finish what they start, and that rule still applies, even when what you're finishing is a sentence that feels like the end of one part of your life. "I know you love your house," she wrote, and my throat tightened at that, because it meant she understood at least a little. "And I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I just don't want to get a phone call someday that something happened and none of us were there." And I pictured her at her kitchen table, probably with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, worrying about those invisible phone calls that live in the back of all our minds once we become parents, those terrible what-ifs that never quite sleep. "Can we at least talk about it?" she wrote at the end. "I love you, Mom. Please don't be mad. Love, Anna." And there it was, that little girl under all the grown-up talk, asking me not to be mad, and my anger, which had been flaring bright, softened into something heavier and more complicated, something like grief mixed with gratitude. Because what a blessing it is, really, to have a child who cares enough to risk your anger, even if the way she does it makes your chest feel too tight. I folded the letter slowly and slid it back into the envelope, the paper crackling softly, and I left it on the table beside the salt shaker, like a guest who hadn't decided yet whether they were staying for dinner. And I made myself some toast I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands, the warm, dry crunch of it in my mouth, reassuring in its ordinariness, the scrape of the knife on the plate sounding louder than usual. And I thought about how much of a woman's life is spent doing this, pairing big feelings with small domestic tasks so we don't come apart at the seams. As I ate, my eyes kept drifting to the envelope, and my mind, as it tends to do now, wandered backward, stitching together old scenes with the present, because time is less of a straight line at my age and more like a drawer full of scarves you keep pulling out in the wrong order. And I saw my daughter at 16 standing at another kitchen table in another house, telling me she wanted to go away to college 3 states over instead of to the perfectly good one in town. Her eyes bright with a mix of fear and defiance, and how I'd felt then, that same tug of war between wanting to keep her close where I could see if she was safe, and knowing that letting go just enough was my job. "You're too young," I'd said then, my voice sharper than I meant, and she'd crossed her arms, her chin lifting in that way that always reminded me of my own, and said, "Mom, I'll never stop being your daughter, but I can't stay in this house forever." And I remember the sting of those words, even though I'd known they were true. And now, sitting alone decades later with her letter on my table, it occurred to me that maybe she thought some version of that about me now, that she loved me but couldn't keep me in this house forever either, and that thought sat heavy in my chest. When the phone rang that afternoon, it made me jump, the sound sudden and sharp in the quiet, my nerves closer to the surface than usual, and I wiped my fingers on a dish towel before picking up, as if the phone cared whether my hands were clean. And I said, "Hello?" in that cautious way I always use now, because too many calls these days are strangers trying to sell things or steal your money. And there was a pause, and then a familiar voice, deeper now, but still with that little upward lilt at the end of sentences. "Hey, Mom." And just like that, the weight in my chest shifted, because there is nothing quite like hearing your child's voice say that word, no matter how old they are. "Hi, honey," I said, and I could hear traffic faintly in the background on her end, the muffled sound of a blinker clicking, and I pictured her in her car, probably calling between errands, squeezing me in like she always did, not out of carelessness, just because that's what modern life seems to do to people, carve their days into too many small pieces. "Did you get my letter?" she asked, and I could tell she was trying to sound casual, the way you ask if someone received the sweater you mailed them, not the conversation that might change the shape of their days. And I looked over at the envelope on the table, the way it lay there so politely, and for a moment I considered lying, just to buy myself time, but time is a different kind of currency when you're my age, and I've learned the hard way that you shouldn't waste it on pretending. "I did," I said, and there was another small silence, the kind that feels crowded with things unsaid. And then she sighed, a little exhale that told me she'd been holding her breath. "I hope you know it comes from a place of love," she said, and I said, "I know, because I do, truly." And I heard myself add, "But it also feels a bit like you're measuring my life in emergency room visits that haven't happened yet." And she gave a short, rueful laugh. "Mom, that's not fair," she said, but her voice was soft. I'm scared. You're there alone. Mark's all the way in Vancouver, we're down here, and you're up there in that house by yourself, with that steep staircase and the icy driveway in winter, and I just don't like it, okay? My son, Mark, is my quieter child, the one who loves but doesn't fuss, who sends funny text messages and quick "love you, Mom" emails between business trips, the one who tells me about the weather and the new coffee shop on his corner more than about his feelings. And I realized, in that moment, I had been thinking of his distance as simply geography, not allowing myself to picture him pacing his faraway apartment, wondering if his phone would ring with bad news one day, the way Anna did. "I understand that you're scared," I said slowly, tasting the honesty of it as I spoke, "and maybe I haven't helped by glossing over some things." And I heard her make a small, worried sound. "What things?" I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the cold bathroom floor, the humiliating struggle, the way I'd sat afterward on the closed toilet lid, with my head in my hands, feeling like someone had snuck into my house and rearranged all my furniture, except the furniture was my own body. I did have a fall, I admitted, worse than I let on, and I could almost hear her heart drop on the other end of the line, the way the silence changed shape. "Mom," she said, my name turning into a sigh, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew we'd be having this conversation," I replied, and we both laughed a little, though it wasn't funny at all. It was just that strange kind of laughter people use when the alternative is to cry, and they're not ready for that. Yet I told her about the fall, not in gruesome detail, but not sparing the part about how long it took me to get up, and I could hear her breathing, quick and uneven, as if she were climbing a hill, and when I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Do you have any idea what that feels like to hear from 3 states away?" That question landed between us, like an old photograph we were both studying for the first time, and I thought about all the times I had worried about her when she was younger, driving in snowstorms or going out late with friends I didn't know well, the way I'd sat by the window and watched for headlights, feeling both foolish and tethered by an invisible string to wherever she was. "I have some idea," I said quietly, and we were both silent for a moment, sharing that old familiar fear of losing each other just in a new way. "I'm not trying to take away your independence," she said. I want you somewhere where, if you do slip in the shower, someone notices in 5 minutes, not after you've been there for half an hour talking yourself through it." And I had to admit, the image of someone coming quickly when I called, of not having to drag my own weight across cold tiles, had a certain appeal, but it also scratched at my pride, at the part of me that's still that young woman who insisted on carrying the heavier end of the couch when we moved into this house. "I hear you," I said, "because that's something I've learned matters more than anything in a family. The willingness to say, 'I hear you,' even when you're not ready to say, 'I agree.' But I need you to hear me too, honey. This house. It's not just walls and a mortgage payment. It's where I brought you home from the hospital. It's where your father sat at that table, figuring out how to pay for your braces. It's where your brother learned to ride a bike in the driveway, crashing into the bushes every time. It's where your father died. My voice caught a little on that last part, because even after 7 years, those words still feel like a stone in my mouth. And there was a long pause. Henry died in the recliner by the front window, in case you're wondering, in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, his hand in mine, a baseball game recorded on the TV because he'd fallen asleep before the 9th inning. And sometimes I still expect to see the indent of his shoulders in the cushion when I walk by, even though we replaced that chair when it started to sag. "I know, Mom," Anna said, her voice thick, "and I'm not trying to erase Dad or our memories, but Dad would haunt me if I didn't at least try to make sure you're safe." That made me smile because it was true. Henry had always been the worrier about practical things, checking the smoke detectors, making sure the car had gas, shoveling the sidewalk before anyone else was awake, and I could almost hear him clearing his throat in that gentle way he had when he wanted to nudge me toward common sense. "Can we take this one step at a time?" I asked, "Maybe you send me some information about these places you're talking about, and I'll look. That's all I can promise right now, that I'll look." It cost me something to say that to open even a small window to the idea of leaving this house. But I could hear the relief in her voice, the way it lightened like clouds parting. "Okay," she said, "that's all I'm asking. Just look, and maybe we can schedule a visit next time we come up." We talked about other things after that. My neighbor's new baby, the tomatoes in her garden that the squirrels kept stealing, a new show she thought I might like. But the conversation had that feeling of a table that's been quietly set for a meal you're not quite ready to eat yet. And when we finally said goodbye, I sat for a long time with the silent phone in my hand, staring at the letter on the table. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen, turning the countertop from dull to honey-colored, highlighting every little chip in the ceramic mug Henry bought me at a roadside stand in Vermont. And my hip began to ache in that familiar, nagging way it has since the fall. And I thought about how strange it is to have your body become a factor in your living arrangements, like a fussy landlord whose demands you can't escape. I tried to imagine myself in one of those communities Anna described, though my mind kept picturing the glossy brochures I'd seen in the doctor's office, all smiling gray-haired couples playing cards or walking on manicured paths, their teeth too white, their clothes too coordinated, and I felt a resistance rise up in me, something stubborn and earthy. "Maybe it's not all like that," I said to the empty kitchen, and the refrigerator hummed again, as if in skeptical agreement I needed a distraction. So I went to the hall closet to get the vacuum, and as I opened the door, one of the old cardboard boxes on the top shelf shifted and tumbled down, landing with a soft thud at my feet, sending up a little cloud of dust that made me cough. The box was one of the ones I'd meant to sort through someday, a word that has become more slippery lately, and it had split open at the corner, spilling out a tangle of old photographs and folded letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and I found myself sinking carefully to the floor, ignoring the protest in my knees, drawn the way you always are to those fragments of your earlier self. On top of the pile was a picture of me at 21, holding baby Anna, taken by Henry, in this very house, back when the walls were still bare and the curtains were just borrowed sheets pinned up to keep the morning sun from waking the baby too early, and my hair was long and dark, and the expression on my face was part terror, part fierce love, the way new mothers look when they haven't yet learned how to hide their vulnerability. "You always were a serious baby," I murmured to the photograph, studying the way infant Anna's tiny fists were clenched, her brow slightly furrowed, and I remembered the long nights walking the hall with her, singing every lullaby my own mother had ever hummed, the weight of her in my arms, making my shoulders ache in the sweetest way. And I thought about how far we'd both traveled from those nights, and how, in some ways, we were back at the start again, worrying about each other's safety in the dark. Under that were more photos. Mark in his kindergarten Halloween costume, Henry grilling in the backyard with a dish towel over his shoulder, my parents sitting stiffly on this very couch, visiting for the first time after we moved here. My mother already criticizing the small size of the kitchen, while secretly pleased I'd chosen a house with a proper dining room. And then there was a photo I hadn't seen in years. Me at 13, standing in front of my parents' old house in the town I grew up in, the paint peeling from the porch railing, my hair in 2 braids, my eyes narrowed against the sun, and against something else, something inside me that didn't have a name yet, that teenage desire to leave and stay at the same time. Seeing that old house brought a sudden, sharp pang to my chest, the way certain places do even after decades, and I thought of my hometown, the one I hadn't visited in years, not since before Henry got sick, the one I'd always planned to go back to someday, to show my grandchildren where their grandmother had walked to school in the snow and sat on the church steps eating penny candy. And I realized with a small jolt that some of those landmarks might not even be there anymore, that the world doesn't keep your childhood on ice for you, waiting until you're ready to revisit it. I picked up one of the folded letters, tied with the ribbon, and untied the knot, my fingers slower and stiffer than they used to be, and unfolded the paper, smoothing it on my lap. It was a letter from my oldest friend, Elaine, written when we were both 32, right after Henry and I had moved to this town. Her handwriting looped and casual, full of little jokes about our high school days and questions about my new life. I hadn't thought of Elaine in weeks, maybe months, but now memories of her came rushing back. Us passing notes in geometry class, her whispering to me in the church pews about the boy she liked, the way we'd lain on our backs in the summer grass behind her father's hardware store, talking about where we'd be when we were old, our young voices blithely tossing decades around like confetti. We'd done a decent job of staying in touch for a while after I married Henry and moved away. But then her life got busy, and mine did too. And somehow we'd slipped into sending only Christmas cards with brief updates, and then even those stopped a few years after Henry died, when the holidays felt less like something to celebrate and more like something to endure. As I read that old letter with its cheerful descriptions of the town fair and her toddler's tantrum in the middle of the grocery store, I felt a strange mix of warmth and regret, like looking at a favorite dress you can't quite fit into anymore. And I wondered where she was now, if she was still in our hometown, if she still walked down Main Street and past the house where I grew up, if she ever thought of me when she did. The idea of my hometown stirred something restless in me, something that had nothing to do with senior communities or fall risks. And I found myself thinking, if everyone is so worried about where I should be living, maybe I should at least be part of that conversation in a way that isn't just saying yes or no. Maybe I should remind myself what it feels like to stand in a place where I wasn't always somebody's mother or somebody's widow, where I was just Margaret, the girl with the braids who loved the smell of the bakery on Saturday mornings. The thought slipped in quietly, but once it was there, it sat with surprising weight. I could go back, just for a visit, before any big decisions were made, before my world shrank to fit inside a brochure photo. It wasn't a logical thought in some ways. Traveling at my age isn't like throwing a bag in the car and setting off on a whim. But it wasn't entirely impossible, either. There's a train that passes through a town not far from here, and my pension and Henry's insurance mean I'm not without resources, and my doctor keeps telling me I'm in remarkably good shape for my age, which always sounds like both a compliment and a warning. I put the letters and photos back in the box, though not as neatly as they'd been, and slid it against the wall, promising myself, not someday, but soon, to go through them properly. And I hauled myself back to my feet, using the doorframe for support, listening to the small pops in my knees like distant fireworks. That night, sleep did not come easily, which is saying something because sleep and I have been on shaky terms since Henry got sick. My bed feels too big and too quiet without his soft snore, and the weight of his leg thrown over mine like an anchor. I lay there in the dark, the faint glow of the streetlight slipping in around the edges of the blinds, tracing familiar shapes on the ceiling, and my mind walked circles around the same things. Anna's letter, the shiny, vague idea of senior living, the memory of my parents' house, Elaine's looping handwriting, the cold tile of the bathroom floor against my palms. At some point, I realized my hand had drifted to the empty space beside me on the mattress, fingers resting on the cool sheet where Henry's shoulder used to be. And I felt a swell of loneliness so sudden and deep that it took my breath away, not just for him, but for all the versions of myself that had existed in this house and in that old hometown. Women I hadn't said a proper goodbye to because I'd assumed I'd always have time to visit them later. "What do you think, old man?" I whispered, staring at the ceiling, as if Henry might answer me from wherever he is or isn't, because talking to dead spouses is one of those things you do more and more as the years pass, even if you're not quite sure who you're talking to. Maybe it's just another part of yourself. In the morning, I woke up tired but oddly clear-headed, the way you do sometimes after a fitful night, as if your mind did some housekeeping while you weren't looking, and I shuffled into the kitchen in my worn robe and slippers, the checkered floor cold under my feet, and I made coffee, the familiar hiss and drip and the smell of it filling the room, and I sat at the table with my mug between my hands, the letter from Anna still there like a third party at the conversation I was having with myself. I took out a notepad, the one I keep near the phone for messages, and I wrote at the top, "Things I need to think about," and under that I made 2 columns, one labeled "Stay" and one labeled "Go," because sometimes seeing things on paper helps me sort out the noise in my head. Under "Stay," I wrote, my garden, the neighbors who know me, the grocery store cashier who always asks about my arthritis, my church, the sound of the train in the distance at night, the porch, Henry built, the tree we planted when Mark was born, the way the evening light falls through the kitchen window under Go. I hesitated, then wrote, "Be closer to Anna and the grandchildren. Less worry for everyone. Maybe new friends. Someone to notice if I don't come down to breakfast. Not having to shovel snow. No more steep stairs." And then, after a long pause, I added, "Chance to start a different chapter before someone else writes it for me." I stared at those lists for a long time, sipping my coffee, feeling both proud of myself for being so practical and slightly ridiculous because life isn't a pros and cons list at my age. It's a messy, overlapping story, and the plot twist isn't always yours to choose. And then, almost without thinking, as if my hand belonged to someone braver and more impulsive than I tend to be these days, I turned the page over and wrote one word in the middle. Hometown, and I circled it, the ink pressing deep into the paper. That afternoon, after a doctor's appointment where he told me my blood pressure was borderline and suggested more walking and fewer potato chips, I came home, and instead of turning on the TV for a background noise like I often do, I went straight to the old desk in the guest room where we keep the laptop the kids insisted I learn to use. The computer took its usual sweet time starting up, humming and whirring like an old man getting out of a chair. And while I waited, I caught sight of myself in the reflective dark screen. My thinning white hair pulled back into a clip, the lines on my face deeper than they appear in the forgiving bathroom mirror. My mouth turned down a little at the corners, even when I'm not actually sad, which seems unfair. And for a moment I felt a flicker of self-consciousness, as if the machine could see all the ways I'd fallen behind the pace of the world. When it finally loaded, I opened my email, that cluttered modern mailbox where notes from my children sat side by side with advertisements for things I don't need, and newsletters I never remember signing up for. And there, among them, was a familiar name I hadn't seen in my inbox in years. Almost buried, but not quite. Elaine Walker, subject line, checking in, dated 3 days ago. For a second I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that I'd conjured her just by thinking of her. But there it was, stubbornly real, and my heart did that quick little trip it used to do when I was younger, and a boy I liked said my name, except this time it was for an old friend and all the histories that come with her. I clicked the email open, my fingers trembling just enough to make the cursor wobble, and as the message filled the screen, the house seemed to lean in and listen with me, the clock ticking louder on the wall, the faint sound of a car passing outside, and I felt the world shift just a fraction, as if something was about to be asked of me that I had not, until that very second, realized I might be ready for. The email from Elaine sat open on the screen, like a window I'd forgotten could still exist. Her words simple and a little wobbly in tone, as if she wasn't sure whether reaching for me after so many quiet years was an act of hope or intruding on a life she could only guess at from a distance. And I remember leaning closer, my eyes narrowing the way they do when I'm trying to read small print or sudden emotion, because the first line alone knocked something loose inside me. "Maggie, you came into my mind this week and wouldn't leave," she wrote, using that old nickname only she and Henry ever used back when I was still young enough to feel both embarrassed and secretly warmed by it. And she went on about how she'd found a box of old photos while clearing the storage room above her garage, how she'd seen a picture of the two of us at 17, standing in front of the old bandstand at the county fair, our arms linked like we thought friendship itself was something that would last forever if we just held on tight enough. And she said she laughed at the memory and then surprised herself by crying a little. Not because anything was particularly wrong, she said, but because the older she gets, the more the past seems to sit closer to the surface, as if all those younger versions of herself are hovering just behind her shoulder, waiting to be acknowledged. And I felt a sting behind my eyes, reading that, because it was as if she were describing the exact thing I'd been trying to explain to myself these past months. That sense that the years don't line up neatly anymore, but fold in on themselves like a quilt that's been used too often. She said she wasn't writing for any particular reason, just that she'd been thinking about me, wondering how I was, wondering whether I still made that ridiculous zucchini bread everyone pretended to like back in the day, and she mentioned, almost as a passing note, that she was still in our hometown, still living in the little yellow house she'd bought with her first husband before he ran off with the woman from the insurance office. And she said the town had changed in strange ways. New chain stores mixed awkwardly with the old bakery and hardware shop, the movie theater, now a real estate office, the library bigger and brighter, the field behind the church where we practiced cheerleading, now paved into a parking lot. And she wrote, "If you ever find yourself coming this way, I would love to sit with you on the porch and talk about things that don't make sense to anyone but the two of us." And then she signed it, "With love, always, Elaine." And something in that word always made me swallow hard, because I had forgotten how effortlessly she used it, how casually she treated affection, as if it were a daily language instead of something you needed to ration out. I must have sat there for half an hour, just staring at the screen, my coffee going cold, my hands folded loosely in my lap the way my mother's used to do when she was thinking, and I could feel the edges of a decision forming, even if it wasn't a decision yet, just the soft pressure of possibility, something that might rise into action if I let it. The next day, after a restless sleep, where I dreamed bits and pieces of my childhood street, my father's truck pulling into the driveway, the neighbor's dog barking at the mailman, the squeak of the metal swings at the park, I found myself standing in the living room, holding the printout of the train schedule I'd looked up before bed, the paper fluttering slightly in the draft from the heater, and I kept reading the same line over and over: depart, 10:32 a.m., as if the time itself were some kind of riddle I needed to solve before it could apply to me. I don't know when exactly the idea turned from possibility into plan, but by mid-morning I had half a suitcase open on the bed, clothes laid out beside it, and the house unusually silent, as though it were holding its breath to see if I would really go through with it. And I found myself walking from room to room, not to pack, but to look, to feel each quiet space, in case this visit to my hometown, this sudden spark of wanting to see who I had been long before I was someone's mother or someone's widow, ended up marking the beginning of something that might shift my life in a direction I hadn't imagined. I paused longest in the living room where the recliner used to sit, tracing the air as if the outline of Henry's shape still lingered there. And I whispered, "I'm not running away, I promise," even though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true, because part of me was afraid that the letter from Anna and the email from Elaine arriving so close together wasn't coincidence at all, but some quiet summons to look at the pieces of my life spread out on the table and decide what to do with them before someone else did it for me. When I called Anna to tell her I'd decided to visit my hometown for a few days, she sounded startled at first, then concerned, and then something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe relief, maybe confusion, maybe that mixture of both that daughters often feel when their mothers do something slightly out of character, but not entirely alarming. "You're going alone?" she asked, and I could hear her shifting the phone from one ear to the other, the way she does when she's trying to think of a diplomatic response. "I mean, Mom, that's a long trip. The train station is a bit of a walk, isn't it? And you haven't been back there in ages. Are you sure you want to go now?" Her questions weren't unreasonable, but I felt a flicker of irritation anyway, that flash of heat that comes when someone, especially your own child, assumes risk before capability. And I heard my voice come out sharper than intended. "Anna, I'm not planning to climb a mountain. I'm visiting a town I lived in for 17 years. I know how to get there, and I know how to walk." There was a pause, and then she exhaled slowly. "I didn't mean it that way, Mom. I just want to make sure you're comfortable. I worry. That's all." The funny thing about growing old is that while your children insist on worrying about you, they don't quite understand how often you worry about them too, even if you never say it, and something in her voice softened that sharpness inside me. "I'll be fine," I told her in a gentler tone, "and I'll call you when I get there, I promise." She hesitated again, and then said, "I'm glad you're doing something for yourself. Really, it's just unexpected." I almost laughed because it was unexpected for me too, but I just said, "Yes, well, life's too short to keep waiting to be ready." And after we hung up, I stood for a moment with the phone still in my hand. Surprised at the truth of my own words, I packed lightly: 2 sweaters, comfortable pants, my worn paperback mystery novel, the shawl my granddaughter crocheted for me last Christmas, and the small tin box where I keep Henry's old train ticket stubs and his watch with the cracked leather band, because I always take them with me when I travel, even if I don't entirely know why. Maybe because having them in my suitcase feels like carrying a part of him that still wants to see where I'm going. The morning of the trip, the sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that makes the world feel quieter and closer, and I boarded the bus to the station with my small suitcase bumping against my leg, the fabric seats smelling faintly of winter coats and wet leaves. And I watched the familiar streets pass by, noticing how the bare trees looked like ink drawings against the pale sky. And I felt a strange mix of nerves and pride, the sensation of doing something on my own that no one expected me to do. At the station, the platform was cold underfoot, the air crisp enough to make my eyes water, and when the train pulled in with a long sigh of brakes, I felt a flutter in my stomach that reminded me of leaving home the first time at 18, my suitcase smaller and my fear larger, but the same sense of stepping into an unnamed chapter. The rhythm of the train soothed me once we were moving, the gentle sway and the soft clacking of the wheels like a heartbeat, and I spent long stretches simply looking out the window at the bare fields and clusters of houses, each one containing someone's small private world, each one a reminder that life is wider than the few rooms I move through every day. As towns blurred by, memories arrived without being asked, walking to school with Elaine as the frost sparkled on the grass, my mother calling me in for dinner with that mixture of impatience and affection. The creak of the screen door when my father came home from work, smelling of machine oil and winter air, my teenage self staring at the town limit sign and imagining everything beyond it as some bright future that I could only reach by leaving. By the time the train pulled into my hometown station, I felt both older and strangely young, as if all the versions of me were walking alongside me as I stepped onto the platform. The station itself had changed. New benches, brighter lights, a coffee kiosk that smelled nothing like the burnt, watery stuff I remembered. But the big brick wall along the parking lot was the same, the one where Henry and I carved our initials on the night he proposed, laughing because we knew it was silly and because we didn't care. I dragged my suitcase across the uneven pavement, the sound of its wheels echoing faintly, and I stood by the taxi line, breathing in the cold air, noticing how it tasted slightly metallic, the way winter always does. Here, as if the wind carries a trace of the old factories, even though most of them shut down decades ago. The taxi driver was a young man with a tired face and kind eyes, and when I told him the address of the small motel near the center of town, he nodded and helped me with my suitcase, his politeness quiet and unassuming, the sort that reminds you people still manage to be gentle in a world that often feels hurried. As we drove, I stared at the storefronts, some changed, some stubbornly the same, and my chest tightened a little when I saw the bakery still standing, the sign newly painted but the roofline unmistakable, and I caught myself imagining the smell of warm bread and the clatter of the old register, the one Mrs. Hargrove used to bang shut with more force than necessary. The motel was modest, 2 stories with faded blue shutters and a row of vending machines humming outside the lobby. And the room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the ghosts of other travelers, but the bed looked soft and the heater worked, and that was enough. After setting my bag down, I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the quiet settle, and then I reached for my phone and typed a short message to Elaine. "Arrived in town, would love to see you. Are you free later?" I stared at the message for a long second before hitting send, feeling suddenly foolish and hopeful at the same time, as if I were 17 again, asking a friend if she wanted to hang out after school. Her reply came quickly, faster than I expected, and reading it made me smile without meaning to. "Maggie, I can't believe you're here. Come over whenever you're ready. I'll put on a pot of tea." Something in those words, maybe the casual warmth of them, maybe the simplicity of being welcomed without question, eased something inside me that I hadn't realized was clenched. I left the motel around 4, the sky already shifting to that late winter blue-gray that hints at early darkness, and the air brisk enough to make me pull my coat tighter, and I walked slowly through the streets, letting the buildings and houses reintroduce themselves to me. When I reached Elaine Street, a quiet row of older houses with wide porches and tall leafless trees, I felt my breath catch because it looked almost exactly as I remembered, and I stood at the end of her walkway for a moment, taking in the yellow siding, the wind chimes tinkling softly near the porch swing, the glow of a lamp in the front window. I knocked, my hand trembling slightly, and the door swung open almost immediately, and there she was, grayer hair, softer lines around her mouth, glasses perched halfway down her nose, but unmistakably Elaine, my childhood co-conspirator, my secret keeper, my long-ago daily companion, and the moment she saw me, her face lit up with something pure and unscripted. "There you are," she said, her voice warm and slightly shaky, and before I could form a reply, she pulled me into a hug that made my eyes blur with sudden tears, the way memory and present folded into each other without asking permission. Inside, her house felt lived in and welcoming, the kind of place where mismatched mugs sit proudly beside framed photos, where the furniture shows signs of being used and loved, and she guided me to the kitchen, where the kettle whistled brightly on the stove. We sat at her small table, the same table from her parents' house, now a little scratched and faded, and she poured tea into 2 chipped floral cups, and we looked at each other with that mixture of joy and disbelief that comes with unexpectedly finding someone you thought you'd gradually misplaced over the years. "You look good, Maggie," she said, studying me with that straightforward affection she's always had. Older, of course, but good. The kind of good that comes from surviving things. I laughed softly at that, feeling both flattered and exposed, and I told her she looked the same, only wiser, and she shook her head, waving the compliment away with a flick of her hand like she used to do when she was a girl. For a while we talked lightly about her children, my children, the odd aches of aging, the quirks of living alone. But beneath the surface of our words, something unspoken hummed, some shared understanding that this visit was more than a nostalgic detour. At one point, Elaine reached across the table and touched my hand, her fingers warm and familiar, and she said quietly, "I'm glad you came, Maggie. I've missed you more than I realized." The simple truth of that sentence washed over me like warm water, and I felt that strange, delicate ache of reconnecting with someone who knew you long before life made its deeper imprints. "I've missed you too," I said, my voice soft, and for a moment neither of us spoke, letting the weight of all the years we hadn't shared balance itself gently between us. After tea, she convinced me to stay for dinner. Simple tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, the kind of meal we used to make in high school when her parents were out. And as we stood side by side in the kitchen, slicing cheese and buttering bread, I felt an ease in my body I hadn't felt in years, as if the rhythm of cooking together rewound something tight inside me. At one point she glanced over and said, with a hint of mischief, "Do you remember the night of the senior dance? When you cried in the bathroom because you thought Henry wasn't going to show up?" I blinked, startled at the memory, then laughed, though the sound wavered slightly. "Oh, Lord," I said, shaking my head. I'd forgotten how dramatic I was back then. Elaine raised an eyebrow. "You weren't dramatic. You were in love and terrified. And you know what? When he burst through those gym doors panting because his bike chain had broken and he'd run 2 miles to get to you, I knew right then he was going to love you stubbornly for the rest of his life." The image hit me hard. Young Henry, breathless and earnest, and for a moment I had to press my palm to my chest as if something fluttered too strongly there. "He was something," I said quietly, and Elaine squeezed my arm gently. "He was," she agreed. "And so were you. Still are, actually." We ate in the living room, bowls warm in our hands, sitting on the couch like the girls we once were, our conversation weaving between past and present, between laughter and regrets we didn't bother to disguise. At one point, when the room had grown softly dim, except for the table lamp, Elaine looked at me more seriously than she had all evening. "Maggie," she said, her tone shifting, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what brought you back now, after all this time? I hesitated, feeling suddenly vulnerable. The question too close to the truth I hadn't fully admitted even to myself. I'm not entirely sure, I said slowly, choosing my words with care. My daughter wrote me a letter about considering senior living options, and it stirred something in me. I guess I needed to see where I came from, to remind myself who I've been before I decide who I'm going to be next. Elaine's expression softened, and she nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense, she said. More sense than you think. This age we're at, it demands a kind of inventory, doesn't it? Of memory, of self, of what we're willing to let go of and what we're not. I felt a small shiver move through me because her words settled into something in me that had been floating unanchored. We talked more after that, the conversation deeper, slower, more honest, until the room felt cocooned in shared understanding. When it came time to leave, she walked me to the door, the hallway dim except for a single lamp on the side table, and she hugged me again, lingering the way people do when they fear letting go. Too soon might break something fragile. Come tomorrow, she said. If you feel up to it, there are places here you might want to see. And I'd like to go with you, if you'll let me. I nodded, touched in a way I couldn't quite articulate. And as I stepped onto her porch, the cold air brushing my cheeks, she called softly after me. Maggie. I turned, my hand on the railing. She looked at me with that same expression she'd had the day we graduated high school, a mixture of affection and worry and stubborn loyalty. There's something I want to tell you. Something I probably should have said a long time ago, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But not tonight, tomorrow. And there it was, a soft, unexpected cliff at the edge of the evening, her words settling into me with a quiet thrum, their meaning unclear but unmistakably weighted. And as I walked back toward the motel under the pale orange glow of the streetlights, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and unease, as if something long buried was stirring, something I hadn't realized might change the way I remembered not just my hometown, but pieces of my own life I thought I understood. And by the time I reached my room and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the heater buzz and the distant sound of a car passing, I felt the delicate shift of a hinge inside me, as though tomorrow held something I hadn't yet named but couldn't avoid, something that might ask me to look at my past and myself with new, unguarded eyes. Last night I barely slept, not because anything was wrong exactly, but because my mind kept replaying the way Elaine had looked at me when she said she had something to tell me, her voice quiet and almost apologetic, and I kept wondering what truth from all those years could still be waiting for me after everything that has already happened. And when morning came and the pale light crept into the motel room through those thin curtains that never fully close, I felt that mixture of dread and curiosity that comes when you sense a shift approaching, something subtle but irreversible. And after dressing slowly in the soft gray sweater I'd packed, the one my granddaughter says makes me look cozy in a movie grandma kind of way, I stepped outside into the cold, crisp air, breathing it in the way you do when you're trying to ground yourself before a day you know won't be ordinary. And the walk to Elaine's house felt shorter than yesterday. Maybe because my feet knew where they were going now, or maybe because my heart was beating a little faster, that anticipatory flutter I hadn't felt since waiting for college acceptance letters decades ago. And when I reached her porch, I found her already sitting there with her coat draped over her knees, a mug between her hands, her breath visible in the morning chill. And she stood as soon as she saw me, smiling in that soft, slightly crooked way she always had, as if she were apologizing for taking up space even in her own home. And we hugged again, a little longer this time, maybe because we were both aware that whatever she had to say might nudge our shared history into a slightly different shape. And once inside, she ushered me toward the kitchen where she already had the kettle heating, the room warm from the oven where she'd baked something that smelled faintly of cinnamon and butter. And as we sat at the table, I watched her fingers fidget with the edge of her sleeve, a gesture I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, and she used to tug at her sweater during exam week. And I finally said gently, "You can tell me, you know." And she looked at me with such naked sincerity that I felt my chest tighten before she even spoke a word. And when she did, her voice was low and steady, but edged with the kind of emotion that comes from holding on to something far too long. And she said, "Maggie, back when you and Henry first got serious, there was something that happened. Something I didn't tell you because I thought I was protecting you. And then later, because too much time had passed and I didn't know how to bring it up without reopening things that didn't need reopening." And I blinked at her, surprised but not alarmed yet, because the past is full of small, withheld truths that look bigger in hindsight. And she took a deep breath before continuing. It was the summer after graduation, when he'd gone off to that temporary job in the next town, and we all thought you two were practically married already in your hearts. But one night he called me of all people, and he asked if I could tell you something for him because he didn't want to worry you. And I said yes, because he sounded shaken. And he'd told me there'd been an accident at the job site, a small one, nothing life-threatening. But he'd hurt his wrist, and he didn't want you driving all the way out there to see him like that. So he asked me to tell you he was fine if you asked, and I said I would. But then when you did ask me that week why he hadn't come back for the weekend, I didn't tell you anything at all. I just brushed it off, said he was busy, because I didn't want you to worry or imagine the worst. And then, when he recovered quickly, it felt like the moment to tell you had passed. And the truth is, Maggie," and here her voice cracked slightly, "I'm not sure he ever knew you didn't know. And I've wondered all these years if I stole from you the chance to be there for him, even in a small way. And it's bothered me more than it probably should have. But it's the truth I never said." At first I just stared at her, my mind trying to place that summer in its proper drawer, remembering the long, warm evenings when I used to sit on my parents' porch, waiting for Henry's car to appear at the end of the street, remembering how disappointed I'd been the weekend he didn't come, how I'd tried to hide it by going to the fair with my cousins, telling myself he must have had a good reason. And suddenly it came flooding back. How distant he'd been, that next phone call. How I'd sensed something was wrong, but chalked it up to the exhaustion of long workdays. And hearing it now, years and years later, something inside me wobbled, not in anger, but in a kind of tender sadness, because the truth wasn't dramatic at all. It didn't change my marriage or my memories of him. It was simply one of those small, missed moments life hands you, the kind you don't realize mattered until you're old enough to see how rare the chances are to show up for someone in their vulnerability, and I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, saying quietly, "Oh, Elaine, that was such a small thing, and you were just a girl like I was, trying to make the kindest choice you knew how." And she shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes, saying, "Maybe, but I should have told you at some point, especially after he passed. I just couldn't bring myself to add even a sliver of pain to what you were already carrying." And hearing that, I felt my own eyes sting because the love in that hesitation was unmistakable, and I squeezed her hand gently and said, "You didn't hurt me. You didn't change anything that mattered. And honestly, I like knowing this now. It makes him feel real again in a new way, human, and it reminds me that even the people we think we know completely have moments we never get to witness." And she let out a shaky laugh, wiping her eyes with the heel of her palm, and the air between us eased, not in a dramatic, sweeping way, but in that soft, almost invisible shift that happens when old friends finally lay down something they've been carrying far too long. And after a few quiet moments, she stood abruptly and said, "Come on, there's somewhere I want to take you before the weather changes." And I pulled on my coat as she grabbed her keys, and we stepped outside into air that had warmed just enough to feel promising. And she led me down the street to the small park where we used to sit on the swings as girls, talking about boys and parents and our dreams of what life might be like when we finally grew into ourselves. And the park looked smaller now, of course. Everything from childhood does. But the swings were still there, though the chains were newer and the paint was different. And she motioned toward the second swing, the one I always claimed, saying, "Sit." So I did, laughing at how low it felt, my feet touching the ground easily. And she sat beside me, our swings barely moving. And she said, "I brought you here because I want to ask you something that I'm not sure I have the right to ask." And I felt my stomach flutter again, the same sensation as when she told me last night she had something important to say. And I turned to her, steadying myself, and said, "Ask me." And she took a breath, pressing her lips together for a moment before saying, "Are you thinking about leaving your house? Really leaving it? Or are you just visiting the past before you say no to Anna's ideas?" And the question landed inside me with surprising clarity, like she had taken the scattered pieces of my thoughts and arranged them in a straight line. And I pushed gently against the ground with my foot, making the swing sway a little, and I said slowly, "I don't know yet. I love my house. But I'm also tired of being alone there and tired of my children worrying every time the phone rings, and tired of pretending I'm not getting older when my body reminds me daily that I am." And Elaine nodded, not interrupting, just listening the way she's always listened. And I continued, "But leaving feels like erasing something I'm not ready to erase. And staying feels like holding on to something I'm not sure is serving me anymore. I guess that's why I'm here, to see if the person I was before all the roles and responsibilities still exists somewhere." For a moment she didn't say anything, and the cold wind rustled through the dry branches above us. And then she said quietly, "Then let's go find her." And she stood, brushing off her coat, and together we walked toward the path that led to the old neighborhood where I grew up, each step feeling strangely momentous, even though nothing dramatic was happening around us. No music swelling, no crowds watching, just two older women moving through a town filled with echoes. And When we turned onto my childhood street, I stopped short because the sight of it hit me with a force I hadn't expected. The houses familiar but altered, the trees taller than memory allowed, the sidewalk cracked in new places, and yet beneath all the change was a pulse I recognized deep in my bones, something that whispered, "You were here once, and you mattered, even before anyone needed you." We walked slowly, taking in the details, the peeling paint on the old Miller house, the new porch swing on the Parker place, the absence of the Andersons' big maple tree that had apparently been cut down years ago. And when we reached my parents' house, I felt an odd mixture of grief and comfort, because while the siding had been replaced and the shutters repainted a bold blue instead of the old hunter, green, the slope of the roof and the curve of the walkway were exactly the same, and I could almost see my childhood self racing down the steps to catch the school bus or sitting on the porch with my father as he whittled small shapes out of scrap wood, and Elaine stood beside me silently, letting me take it in, and after a long moment she said softly, "You don't have to decide anything today, Maggie. You don't even have to decide this week. But you're not alone, not in this place, not in your life, not in what comes next." And those words, simple as they were, settled in my chest like a stone and a balm at the same time. And I realized then that this visit wasn't just about revisiting the past. It was about remembering that I still had people in the world, connections that hadn't vanished just because decades had passed. And as we turned back toward her house, the sun slipping behind the clouds, I felt something shift inside me, a kind of softening, a loosening of the knot that had formed around the idea of leaving my house. And I didn't have answers yet, not even close. But for the first time, I felt open to the possibility of finding them, whatever they might be. And by the time we reached her porch again, the wind picking up and the sky hinting at evening, I felt a tiredness settle over me, not the kind that weighs you down, but the kind that comes after you've done something your heart needed, even if you didn't know it until after it happened. And as I hugged Elaine goodbye, she held me a little longer than before and whispered, "Come back tomorrow." And I nodded, promising I would, though I had no idea that tomorrow would bring a message waiting in my motel room that would tilt everything, ever so slightly, in yet another direction. That evening, after I returned to the motel with the wind still clinging to my coat and a faint ache blooming behind my temples, the way it does when a day holds more emotion than I've had to carry in a while, I noticed the front desk clerk waving a small envelope at me as I stepped into the lobby, his expression polite but curious in that unobtrusive small-town way. And when he handed it over and I saw my name written in Anna's handwriting, sharp, neat, a little rushed at the edges, I felt that familiar motherly flutter in my chest, half worry, half tenderness, because letters from one's children rarely arrive without a reason. And as I climbed the stairs to my room, the carpet soft under my tired feet, I hesitated outside my door for a second longer than usual, as if opening the envelope might rearrange something inside me I wasn't quite ready to face. But of course I opened it anyway, sitting on the edge of the bed with the lamp casting that small yellow circle of light that seems to invite truths out of hiding. And the first line read, "Mom, I'm trying not to hover, but I need you to check in," followed immediately by, "Mark called me last night. He's been trying to reach you." and my breath caught a little because my son rarely calls without texting first. So I reached for my phone and saw 2 missed calls from an unfamiliar number that must have been his hotel or wherever he was traveling for work. And before I could overthink it, I called him back, listening to the phone ring as I stared at the motel curtains that billowed slightly with the draft from the heater vent. And when he answered, his voice cracked with that odd mixture of relief and mild frustration. He's always tried to hide from me, he said. "Mom, finally, are you okay?" And I told him I was fine, just visiting my hometown. And there was a brief silence before he said, gentler than before, "Anna told me I think it's good you went. I think maybe it's overdue." And something in his tone surprised me. His usual breezy detachment replaced by a quiet sincerity that made me straighten a little on the mattress, and he went on to tell me he'd been offered a position in Toronto, a bigger role that would mean more money but also more travel, more uncertainty, more distance, and he didn't want to make the decision without talking to me because, as he put it, "You're my anchor, Mom, even if I forget to say it." And hearing that from my son, my quiet child, who often communicates in weather updates and dry humor instead of heart-to-heart admissions, made something warm unfurl in my chest, and I assured him that his life was his own, and that I would never ask him to make his world smaller on my behalf. But even as I said it, I felt that faint tremor of loneliness I've learned to recognize as the undercurrent beneath many of my bravest statements. And after we hung up, I lay back on the bed, fully clothed, the envelope still open beside me, thinking about how unprepared I was for how parenthood evolves, how the roles stretch and bend, how the distance between a mother and her grown children can feel like both a natural truth and a small heartbreak you learn to carry without mentioning. And after a few minutes, I sat up again, because the quiet in the room felt too thick, too heavy. So I slipped my shoes back on and walked outside into the cool evening, letting the air clear my mind as I wandered down the sidewalk past the dimly lit storefronts, each window reflecting back a version of me I barely recognized. Older, yes, but also softer, more permeable somehow, as if these few days back home had loosened a layer of armor I didn't realize I'd been wearing. And I found myself drifting toward the riverbank where Elaine and I used to sit as teenagers, legs dangling off the railing, while we talked about boys and futures and fears we didn't yet have words for. And as I leaned on the railing now, the water dark and slow beneath me, I felt the quiet kind of grief that isn't sharp but deep, the kind that comes from understanding that life keeps evolving, no matter how tightly we try to hold any part of it still. And I don't know how long I stood there, listening to the faint rush of the river and the distant hum of passing cars, before I finally turned back toward the motel, my steps slower now, my breath visible in the cool air, thinking about the house waiting for me back home, the stairs that creak, the porch Henry built, the life imprinted on every wall, but also thinking about the feeling I'd had walking with Elaine earlier, that subtle yet undeniable sense that maybe my roots weren't only tied to a place, but also to people, and maybe it was time to decide which of those roots still nourished me, and which simply kept me frozen in a memory of who I once was. And when I reached my door and paused with my hand on the knob, I realized with a kind of quiet clarity that returning here wasn't just about looking back. It was about figuring out what kind of future I still wanted, and whether it would unfold in the house I've lived in for decades or somewhere I haven't yet imagined. And as I stepped into the room, the heater humming in that soft, imperfect way, I felt a small pull inside me, an intuition I couldn't yet name, as if the next day or the next conversation might tilt the balance of my decision in a way I wasn't entirely prepared for, but also wasn't afraid of anymore. The next morning, I woke with the strange feeling that something inside me had already shifted before I even opened my eyes, as if a decision had been growing quietly overnight, like a vine that finally reached the windowsill. And as I sat up in the dim motel room, the blankets pooled around my waist and the faint rumble of a passing truck outside, I realized I wasn't thinking about my house or my children or even Elaine right away. I was thinking about myself, the version of me I'd glimpsed these past few days, who wasn't defined by worry or routine or the familiar ache of the same four walls. And while I dressed, pulling on the soft, long-sleeved shirt I'd folded so carefully back home, I sensed an odd steadiness in my chest, the kind that comes when fear loosens its grip just enough for curiosity to breathe. And when I opened the door and stepped into the cool hallway, the scent of someone's too strong cologne lingering in the air, I felt strangely present, aware of my own footsteps and the gentle stiffness in my hip and the way my heart moved at its own measured pace, neither rushed nor hesitant, just ready. And as I walked toward Elaine's house, the morning sun pushing through the gray clouds in faint streaks, I found myself replaying the conversation with Mark, the tenderness in his voice, the underlying worry threaded through it, and then Anna's letter, her love tangled with fear, and instead of feeling hemmed in by their concern, I felt something else, a realization that perhaps they weren't trying to shrink my life, but trying to widen the part of it they could still be part of. And that softened something I'd kept clenched for years without intending to. So by the time I reached Elaine's porch, I was already exhaling some old tension I hadn't known I carried. And she opened the door before I could knock, her smile warm and a little tired, as if she too had spent the night turning over thoughts that refused to settle. And she said, "You're up early." And I replied, "So are you." And we both laughed in that quiet, knowing way only old friends can, and she ushered me inside where the kettle was already heating, the smell of toasted bread drifting through the small kitchen, and we sat at the table with our mugs between our hands, steam curling upward like something fragile and fleeting. And after a moment I said, "I keep thinking about what you asked me yesterday." And she nodded slowly, her eyes soft but intent, and I continued, "I'm not ready to leave my house, but I'm not ready to stay exactly as I have been either." And she didn't rush to fill the silence the way some people do. She simply waited, letting me find my words, and I said, "I think I need help. Not full-time, not a move, but something in between. A way to stay where I am without pretending I don't need support." Elaine's expression didn't shift to pity or concern or even surprise. It warmed like someone hearing a truth they'd hoped you'd eventually say out loud, and she reached across the table and touched my wrist lightly, saying, "That sounds like a very brave in-between." And the simplicity of those words made my throat tighten because I hadn't realized how deeply I'd wanted someone to affirm that middle spaces exist, that choices don't always have to be drastic to be meaningful. And after breakfast, we walked again, this time without any particular destination, our pace slow, unhurried, comfortable. And at one point, she slipped her arm through mine the way she did when we were younger, steadying me as we navigated a stretch of uneven sidewalk. And instead of feeling old or fragile, I felt held, connected, reminded that accepting support isn't a loss of independence, but a form of relational courage. And somewhere along that quiet street, I admitted to her, quietly, almost shyly, that the fall I'd had at home had scared me more than I let on, not just because of the pain, but because of the realization that if things had gone differently, if I'd hit my head or broken something more serious, hours could have gone by before anyone knew. And she squeezed my arm gently and said, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Maggie, not even to yourself." And those words sank into me with such unexpected relief that I stopped walking for a moment, looking at her with wet eyes, and she didn't flinch or look away. She just stayed beside me until my breath steadied again. We ended up near the small lake at the edge of town, its surface rippling with a soft breeze, patches of sunlight dancing across it, and we sat on an old wooden bench that creaked under our weight, the kind of sound that feels like a reminder of time rather than a complaint. And we talked about ordinary things, her garden plans for spring, my church choir back home, the way aging rearranges friendships rather than ending them. And at one point she said, "What will you tell Anna?" And I sighed, watching a pair of ducks skim the water, and said, "The truth that I'm thinking about making some changes, that I'm not ignoring her worries, that I'm not ready to let go of my home, but I'm ready to make it safer, easier, more connected." And saying it out loud felt like opening a window in a stuffy room I'd lived in for too long, letting the air shift and circulate. And Elaine nodded with that gentle approval that doesn't steer or push, it simply encourages. And after a long, peaceful stretch of silence, she added, "And when you go home, if you ever need someone to come stay for a week, to help you go through old boxes or sort the pantry or just sit with you in the evenings, you call me. I mean it. I'm not that far, and I'm not doing anything more important." And something in her tone, steady, sincere, unadorned, made my eyes sting again, because I hadn't realized how deeply I'd missed being offered companionship without conditions or apology. The walk back to town felt different, lighter somehow, and when we reached her house and she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "Don't be afraid of choosing what's good for you." And I nodded into her shoulder, thinking how strange it is that at nearly 80 years old, I still need to be reminded of that. And as I returned to the motel, the air sharper now with the hint of approaching evening, I found myself thinking not about endings or losses, but about adjustments, about the idea that a life can be reshaped gently rather than shattered or replaced. And as I reached my room, my phone buzzed with a message from Anna, a photo of my granddaughter holding up a hand-drawn picture of the two of us standing together under a big yellow sun. And the caption read, "Grandma, when are you coming home?" And for the first time in a long while, the word home didn't feel like an ultimatum or a burden or a question of geography, but something expansive, flexible, layered. And I sat on the edge of the bed holding the phone, the picture glowing softly in my hand, realizing I was no longer afraid of what waited for me when I returned, because for the first time in years, I wasn't planning to go back unchanged. When the train finally carried me home, the winter fields blurring past the window like half-forgotten memories, I felt no dramatic revelation, no thunderclap of certainty, just a quiet steadiness settling inside me, the kind that grows when you've let yourself be honest long enough to hear your own voice again. And as the conductor called my stop and I stepped onto the familiar platform with my small suitcase bumping gently behind me, I realized I didn't need to have every answer yet, only the willingness to shape the rest of my life with intention instead of fear. So I lifted my chin against the cold wind, thinking of Anna's letter, of Mark's hesitant vulnerability, of Elaine's steady presence, of the house waiting for me not as a trap but as a chapter still willing to be rewritten. And as I walked toward the taxi stand, snow beginning to fall in soft, tentative flakes that melted the moment they touched my coat, I felt something inside me loosen and brighten all at once, as if the years ahead, however many remained, might still hold their own small rebellions of joy. And, with that simple, surprising hope warming my chest, I said aloud to no one, "All right, Margaret, let's begin again."